Next, we have our afternoon keynote. I know many of you are really looking forward to hearing from our next speaker, Dr. Condoleezza Rice. But before we properly introduce her, I'd like to introduce the moderator, my SIEPR colleague, Professor Greg Rosston. Professor Rosston is the Gordon Cain Senior Fellow at SIEPR and Director of the Public Policy Program at Stanford. He teaches courses on competition policy and strategy, intellectual property, and personal finance. So please join me in welcoming Greg to the stage.
Thanks. Thank you. I'm thrilled to have the honor to introduce Secretary Condoleezza Rice. My former boss, John Chauvin, always said, the better known someone is, the shorter the introduction should be. I'm not going to stop right there, but what I'm going to do is let you read the bio, and you all know everything about her, except for something that my view as I'm not only at SIEPR, I'm also the director of the Public Policy Program. And there are lots of places to do academic research, and there's lots of places to do policy stuff, but the big thing at Stanford is to be involved with students. And I've had the honor of having Secretary Rice come and talk to my classes. I know students who had her as an advisor, and she's amazing. This is, you might think of a university as being left-leaning and not open to ideas, but she has an incredible waiting list for her classes, high demand as an advisor, and she's fantastic in a classroom, and you're going to get to enjoy that for the next 30 minutes. So welcome Dr. Rice with me. I'm trying to figure out where the middle. I'm trying to figure out where the middle was. So thanks a lot for coming. I know, today we've had this conversation about competition, and as an antitrust guy, I think of competition as competition between firms. And I know in most of your life, competition has not necessarily been market competition among firms, but competition among countries. And we heard Venki Ganesan in the last session talk about having pro-innovation, pro-competition, and pro-US, I think is what you said. And thinking about, how do you think about how AI is going to affect competition?
Yes. Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. And I know it's been a really interesting discussion. I think it's awfully important that we have these fora, because I think a lot of people in the policy world have learned to spell AI, but they're still not perhaps certain about its implications. And so continuing to talk about it is really important. You're right, Greg, that competition for me generally throughout my career has meant something else, and I'll get to that in a moment. But one of the reasons that I believe that the United States, with proper attention to its innovation ecosystem, which has an academic element, it has a private sector element, and of course then has government policy, that attention to that will give the United States the advantage in the competition that I'm about to describe, is that it is, in fact, the competition of ideas, the competition of capital, the competition for markets that has driven our economy, and I think made us the most powerful economy in the world. And I think these frontier technologies, it will be no different. The very fact that you will have several entities competing for supremacy rather than a single diktat from the government for it, I think gives us a tremendous advantage. And so I hope that nothing that we do abridges our ability to let competition drive innovation in the way that it has in the United States for many, many years. Of course, the other big competitor is China. And I would put it this way, that we're really actually talking about an arms race now in technology, an arms race in frontier technologies. We're talking about AI today, but there's an arms race in synthetic biology, there's an arms race in robotics, there's an arms race in space. And it is really between two countries that have, unfortunately, over recent years become more adversarial in their relationship. And so thinking of it as somebody is going to try to win is not really out of line, even though maybe 20 years or so ago, when we had a kind of integrationist narrative about China in the international economy, we might not have thought about it that way. I've said to many of my Chinese friends, and I think I'm still considered somebody who wants to see a better relationship with China. We had a very good relationship with China in the Bush administration. But I've said that perhaps one of the, let me just put it, dumbest speeches I think I've ever heard given by a leader was the one in which Xi Jinping said that China was going to surpass the United States in frontier technologies like AI and quantum computing. Because what did he think was going to happen? It got our backs up. We said, oh, that's what this is all about. And then the Chinese came up with this thing called civil-military fusion. So we then said, oh, so let me get this right. The Chinese innovation, which we are helping to fuel through investment in Chinese startups and Chinese companies, is going to be handed over to the PLA so that they can expel us from the Indo-Pacific. Well, that doesn't sound like a very good idea. And so what had the potential, I think, to build on the open ecosystem, the open nature of innovation worldwide, has become very hardened into two camps. And I think we are actually decoupling from China quite rapidly and quite dramatically. And that puts this competition in a different framework.
So do you see the government policies of sort of restricting trade and frontier technology with China to be effective in changing the way things are going to work, or is this just delaying the inevitable of China taking over and developing its own things? How do you see the difference in what we're doing as a government policy?
Well, let me separate it into three areas, one of which I'm concerned that maybe the government should try and stay out of, if at all possible. But look, at the frontier, I'm not surprised that that sanctions and restrictions, trade restrictions, even restrictions on inbound and outbound investment have become part of the toolkit for dealing with what is now viewed as China's challenge to American technological supremacy and therefore to American leadership, because after all, technology is probably going to be the dominant factor in what country is most powerful, is most dominant in the international system. This is a very different challenge. People often talk about, well, it's Cold War II. But of course, the Soviet Union was a military giant, but it was a technological and economic midget. And so when you talk about China and you look that they have all three of those elements, military power, technological power, economic power, it's not surprising that the United States is going to try to restrict access to American technologies that can fuel China's progress. It will have, I think, temporary, we don't know how long, but temporary effect. For instance, I'm told by some people who are very high up in Chinese tech that generative AI just not possible. If we deny the NVIDIA chip, it's very difficult to do the kinds of things that you do at the high end. So for some time, yes. But China's a very innovative, creative, smart population. It's putting a lot of resources into this from the top. And this lead, if you will, is not going to last forever. I can't tell you how long it's going to last, but it's not going to last forever. There was a couple of years ago that we were talking about the fact that they could train so much data because they didn't have privacy concerns and so forth, was going to give them the lead. Nobody saw generative coming. Now, if in fact I'm right and the lead is temporary, then what we have to do is to try to continue to out-innovate, is to be in leaps and bounds going ahead, which is why my second point about government policy, even if you're trying to delay China's progress, the second part is do no harm to our own innovation system. And that's where I worry, because regulators will regulate even if they don't know what they're regulating. And one of the things that we're trying to do at Hoover is with Jennifer Whittam, the Dean of Engineering, we've created something called the Stanford Emerging Technology Review, just to try to help policymakers understand what the frontiers of technology look like, to try to demystify some of it so that fear doesn't drive regulation. I heard somebody say recently, well, we have to be sure that we stop anything that's harmful. And I said, how are you going to know what's harmful? You're almost always going to mispredict what innovation might look like. Who would have thought that one of the biggest problems with social media platform would be election interference? So we can't second guess what that will look like. And so I worry that over-regulation, particularly some of that I see from Europe, will actually stall our innovation and not allow us to outrace. And then the third part of government policy that I hope we never see is there was a few years ago, and there are echoes of it, interference in what we do in universities. I'm not going to have nationality tests in my classrooms, and we shouldn't have nationality tests in our labs. I've said to people in our intelligence agencies, I understand the implications of IP theft. I understand the implications of the civil-military fusion programs of China. But if somebody you believe is really working for the PLA, don't give them a visa and we won't admit them. But don't try to turn universities into intelligence agencies. And so I separate government policy into, yes, we should try to slow China's progress to the degree we can. We should recognize that that's temporary. So secondarily, let's not constrain our own innovation. And third, let's try to keep open what has really worked for us, which is the academic ecosystem.
So I'm not sure which direction to go because you brought up so many great issues. Let me start with just the EU. We had the Vice President of the European Commission spoke this morning and talked about what regulations they're doing, and you expressed some concern with what the EU is doing, and I'd love to hear your concern about what they're doing and what we can learn from that and what we're worried about.
Well, it's still evolving, but I've heard about trying to judge, for instance, how to stop harmful. I just don't even know how to begin to think about that. And it concerns me that the rush to regulate, we might want to live in this ecosystem for a little while, and things will emerge that perhaps do need regulation. But if you're trying to prefigure a regulation for something that is evolving this quickly, you're almost always going to make mistakes. And so I've been concerned about the rush to regulate. I'm also hopeful that the European Union and the European Commission will understand that a lot of the innovation is actually not in Europe. And so you could have a separation from the regulatory structures and where the innovation is actually taking place. This is where the absence of Great Britain in Europe is a big problem, because the innovation is taking place in the UK, in places like Oxford, DeepMind, so forth. And so how to penetrate the conversation in the EC and the EU about regulation with people who are actually part of the innovation ecosystem, I think is a real challenge for us. I've been asked all the time about, are there some kind of international frameworks that we could use? And I often say, let's start with like-minded countries. Let's start with countries that share values. And obviously we share values with the members of the European Union, with the UK. I would add that there are technologically sophisticated countries that maybe not yet in AI, but have certainly the kind of engineering capability and smarts. India is a country that ought to be a part of this discussion. You want to talk about scaling a technology, a biometric ID for 1.3 billion people that's attached to a bank account. I was in New Delhi recently, and I was at a conference, and they were describing how they use the biometric ID to manage COVID response. And I said, well, that's really amazing. You know, if Tom Stevenson goes for his shot and they say, no, Tom, your biometric ID says it should be 2 weeks from now. And so I said, yeah, but here's how a really sophisticated country handles this. And I held up my tattered little vaccine card, right? Of which I've had 2 or 3 because I keep losing them. And so there are other countries that can be, Japan, there are countries that can be a part of this discussion that are like-minded. I would start there.
So I was at a conference last week where you spoke about, when you were Secretary of State and you had these telecommunications conferences and you looked around to see who wasn't doing anything and sent them off to these negotiations. Killed me as a telecom person at that. But then I went to my computer yesterday and saw there was another working group for a international telecom conference, and my eyes glazed over.
Yeah.
How important are these sort of deep, under the details organizations for thinking about how you would have international cooperation and trying to get this idea of, do you get India, do you get the EU, do you get everybody, or do you start with a small number, and how do these organizations work to help you get there?
Yeah, well, I repeat, I start with a small number, but to your point, Greg, so it is absolutely true. When the ITC or somebody was about to have a conference, I would say, I really can't afford to send somebody who's working on something important. Let me find somebody who can go. And my guess is that that was happening among my colleagues in a number of countries, but the one country that wasn't happening in was China. And so they were sending people to these conferences, particularly UN conferences, where a lot of the rules making takes place. And so the rules making gets embedded by people who sit there and go through, the 48-hour conferences on mind-numbing ideas. But now if you look at a lot of the rulemaking, Beijing had a big hand in it because we weren't paying attention. So I do think it's really important to recognize that a lot gets buried by mattress mice, and you have to make sure that they're your mattress mice, not somebody else's, that are involved in those discussions. Yeah. So I'm reformed on that, and have, by the way, mentioned it to my successors that maybe they should think differently about it.
So another point you talked about was universities, and we've heard a lot today about the scale of these AI foundation models, and also, as you said, you have a new thing with Jennifer Whittam at the Hoover Institution on putting academia in the mix. But how does academia get in the mix without the massive resources?
Yeah. Well, when you talk about AI, and the panel before was just discussing this, and the problem of not enough compute power. No university or combinations of universities can do the kind of high-scale generative AI large language models that we're seeing in the commercial sector. And that's a question, I think, for the country. Is it the case that we want this level of technology to only be done in, there'll be competition. Microsoft and Google and maybe Meta will go to the mat with one another. But look, I'm as dyed-in-the-wool capitalist as you'll ever find. So let me just put that on the table. But do I really want this only to be in the commercial sector? And I think that's a question for the country to ask. And if, in fact, you would like to have the capabilities to do some of these things, one thing, maybe there are industry collaborations with universities. That might be one way to think about it. Or maybe this is a public good in some sense that you want to exist somewhere in the ecosystem around, some people have talked about national labs or whatever. I'm not smart enough to know the answer, but I am smart enough to ask the question. And I think we ought to ask that question. I think it's a question, by the way, that you hear being asked by some of the most forward-leaning of private sector leaders as to what's the proper infrastructure distribution for some of the highest end research that might be done. We do know, we've had discussions about the brain drain from universities, and people think it's a lot about salary. Maybe some of it's about salary, but I'm told that a fair amount of it is about, can I do the kind of research that I want to do in a university, or do I have to go and do that in industry? And that's a big question for the country.
Okay. I want to shift gears here a little bit more about national security. And I know we spend a lot of money on cybersecurity. I'm on the board of the Stanford Credit Union, and we worry about it, but we're a small piece compared to Chase Bank or something like that, where they spend a lot more. And throughout the economy, we spend a lot on cybersecurity. And I'm sure we're going to have to spend more. That's all I know whenever the IT guys come to me. I say, we need to spend more. And we always say yes, because they scare us.
Yes.
So do you, kind of breaking this question into a couple of things, do the advances in AI increase your fear? And do you think that it's a fear of nation-state actors, or what I would call more rogue actors that can leverage this technology? And where should we be worried, and what should we think about?
Well, the big difference with AI and really all of these frontier technologies, except space, where it's a mix between public and private, is that this is kind of the first time that the government hasn't owned the domain in which the competition is taking place. So if you go back to nuclear, for instance, there are always those stories, the kid who reads on the internet how to make a nuclear weapon and holds some city hostage. It's hard to make a nuclear weapon, right? It's really hard. That's one of the reasons countries keep failing at it. So I never actually worried about that. But some of the things that are floating out there in the private domain that is some combination of cyber and AI, and now it looks as if those rogue actors might be more of a problem. They've certainly been a problem in cyber, but I still think the biggest problem is the state actor. I've always been much more concerned about the how much the state actor can bring in terms of resources, in terms of intelligence as to where to target, and the state-sponsored rogue actors. So when Colonial Pipeline went down, it was a so-called Russian criminal group that apparently we believe did it. But something very interesting happened. That criminal group then disappeared. And I don't know whether we told Vladimir Putin, disappear them or we will, or whether we disappeared them. I really don't care. But the fact is, state actors got involved in that kind of case as well. So I worry a lot more about the power that state actors can bring to this. Yes, deepfakes and all of that, this realm opens up a lot of possibility for a lot of bad actors. But state actors, I'd go first after state actors. And one advantage with state actors is that they actually have things to lose. And one reason that we have avoided a nuclear confrontation is you do it to me, I'll do it to you. And that, I think, has possibly been persuasive in some of this higher end cyber activity that we kept expecting and haven't gotten.
So this is, earlier we were talking about sort of the cutting edge AI technology and competition with China as sort of a developer of technology. And it seems like this is also now, hey, this doesn't have to be somebody who's at the cutting edge of technology, but a user of technology. Yeah. And the more we advance it, the better things go. The better it is for users of all sorts, but also these other
actors. There will always be some malign actors. Yeah. There always will be. And, I assume that at some point something bad is going to happen because of a malign actor. And we will do everything that we can in every sector to avoid that. But human history would suggest that somebody's going to manage it at some point.
So in a minute, after the next question, I'm going to open it to the audience for questions. We've talked a lot about regulation. Do you have, you were concerned about not over-regulating, but are there certain things that you think we should be doing, either in terms of regulation or promoting, research, or trying to figure out what do we do, how do we think about things?
Well, I would start with let's not start regulating the research itself. Right? And I do think that there are some norms that you might start to try to establish. That you don't want to do things that would cause mass casualties might be one norm that you could have. But I would take it from that perspective rather than what do we have to stop? Because I just want to repeat, government's not going to be very good at knowing what to stop. And they're going to stop something that either was never going to materialize or something's going to materialize in a completely different way. And so I guess I'm just let's talk about it for a while. Let's have these conversations between those who are actually doing the innovation and those who have to worry about the institutions. Let's have that go on for a while. We'll learn a lot in that period of time, but trying to prejudge what might be a problem seems to me not a very smart way to go about it, given how fast it's emerging, given the wild directions in which it's going. And there's one other point that I would make. We will have these discussions in our democracy. We will have congressional hearings if something goes wrong. We will have investigative reporters that are looking at this. That's why I make the case again that I worry a lot less about this in the hands of democracies than in the hands of autocracies. Ask yourself the question, if the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany had won the race to nuclear weapons. We did, in fact, use them twice and scared ourselves enough that we thought we didn't ever want to do that again. So I think that you want to make sure that this happens in an environment in which the debate is open.
Great, thank you. So now I want to take questions. I see one over here.
Yeah, I was wondering.
Wait for the mic because the people online can't hear.
Yeah, Secretary Rice, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what might happen between China and Taiwan in the next couple of years.
Yeah, sure. Well, wish I do. I find it hard to believe, having talked to a lot of military people like this, that China plans an amphibious landing on Taiwan. I've been told by military people, we're talking about something that makes D-Day look like child's play. Right? There are lots of other ways to put pressure on Taiwan. And I think we've seen a little hint of it over this last week, and we saw a little hint of it after Nancy Pelosi's visit, which is a denial strategy, something that looks like a quarantine, something that keeps Taiwan, which has to be a trading nation, from trading. Maybe combined with cyber, maybe combined with cutting underwater sea cables. And something that is a salami tactic enough alike that it's hard for the United States to know when it needs to intervene. And I have a friend who does a lot of work at the Defense Department, and this person says that one thing that worries her is that every time she goes back to the Defense Department, they're talking about the amphibious landing and these other ways of really isolating Taiwan and making life difficult for Taiwan. They clearly don't like President Lai, or we see that. But there are lots of ways for China to put pressure on Taiwan that might make a lot more sense. And I hope we're beginning to think through how we deter that kind of behavior rather than thinking how we deter an all-out invasion.
We're going to do one here and then go over to the other side.
Secretary Rice, I'm Josh Glonick. I'm a visiting scholar at CSAC here at Stanford. You talked about the dynamic that exists today, whereas the bulk of innovation is happening in the commercial sector, whereas in the Cold War era and before, the government was driving much of the technological innovation. So I'm wondering how you think the U.S. government is doing today with respect to being able to leverage the commercial sector to acquire the technologies that are clearly going to be needed for national security purposes, especially as we look at China with a very different model where they're essentially able to kind of direct their priorities into their private companies for national security development.
Thank you, and I think we're doing very poorly, very poorly. And it's largely because the procurement and acquisition processes in the Defense Department are Baroque to say the least. And no small company that has a brilliant idea or a brilliant product that could make that it would be lower cost and more efficient, almost none of them can penetrate the Pentagon. And there have been multiple people that are trying to deal with this problem. I know CSAC talks about this all the time. We have these what we call track twos between the private sector and the government, because they don't speak the same language. And we had DIU out here that Ash Carter started, and the Pentagon has kind of tried parts of it to kill it in its crib from time to time. And we just keep doing this in a way. And then there's the, we should just make it inside, or we should give it to one of the big guys and let them make it. And we are really not taking advantage of what is our enormous advantage, which is the distributed innovation that our system produces. And we ought to be snapping up these innovations and taking them to the field as fast as possible. And part of this is a congressional problem. Now, Congress makes us extremely sometimes risk-averse about these things, but sometimes you have to try things, and they may not completely work out. But when we put one of those enormous satellites into space, which is billions of dollars over budget and years behind schedule, nobody said, oh boy, that was a failure, so we shouldn't do that again. So why not take some of these smaller risks? So I think it's a big problem for us. It's something we really need to work. Just a very quick story about it. So when I was trying to do something that's very much in the pace, I was trying to do Israeli-Palestinian issues, and we had a settlement freeze in place with Israel, and they would come and they would say, oh no, we're not building settlements. And I knew from our NRO that actually we could see certain things happening. But if I'd been waiting for clearance to show any of that to the Israelis, it would have taken forever. So there was this thing called Google Earth. And so I took out Google Earth. And I said, look at this. Look how that is going that way. If it's going that way, it's okay. And so every month we had a Google Earth test. All right, so there's so much in the private sector that could be helping us, and I don't think we're taking advantage of it.
Okay,
Secretary Rice, I'm David Lowry from the University of Georgia Music Business Program. It's a little off topic, but kind of not. I share your views on free markets and deregulation and such. I'm the only one in the music business, perhaps. But there's sort of this notion that we need to basically sort of suspend the property rights of songwriters and musicians so that we can ingest a lot of this and train AI models. And then essentially that would compete with us for revenue. However, one of the great innovations of the American music industry has been our contributions to soft power. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you know, but I was actually a music major in college. And so this is something I've actually followed because I'm just sort of interested. And the whole question about IP in music goes back a long, long time, right? And one of the things that we know was that Mozart died penniless, but Mozart's wife did not, because she actually fought for the IP for the rights to Mozart's music. So it's been going on for a while, is my point. Look, I think this is a whole area. One of the things that AI is doing is it's challenging just about every area of our societal and legal framework. And I think that we need to start to look at it in those terms. So it's not, we don't want to rush to a conclusion about what AI sweeping the net and therefore creating something that was really taken from the IP of others, and then how do we get proper compensation to those whose IP it really was. I don't think we can solve these problems kind of one at a time. It really needs a hard look at what the legal framework is going to be for these questions around IP, because it's not just in music, it's in a whole realm of the creative world where IP is created and then can be harnessed by others without proper compensation. And that's really the question. One of the people that has just come to Hoover is a lawyer named Eugene Volokh, who is was a professor at UCLA. He's a First Amendment lawyer, but very interested in a lot of these questions about how technology is changing and transforming the needs of our legal structure. And we've had these challenges to it before, but I think a kind of reason we've got to get the lawyers not to litigate as much as maybe get some of the lawyers who might actually be able to think through these things constitutionally and philosophically first. I think that would be a very helpful and important set of conversations to have.
Well, now you guys have had a chance to see why I was so impressed with Dr. Rice in front of a classroom. Now she's been in front of you. She's done this a couple of times before, so she may be a little practiced at it. But fantastic and sort of wide-ranging, from AI to competition to music and everything. And I want to thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was great.